Okay, everybody, we'll get started here. To those of you in the house and online, I'm Darren McGee. I'm the director of the Institute for Energy Studies here at Western Washington University, and we're excited once again to host an alumnus of our program, the Institute for Energy Studies, as a speaker this week in our speaker series. I'm happy to introduce Reece Carpenter. Reece just finished 2 years at the Department of Energy in the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations. She's going to talk about that experience, about what happens in the federal policy making world in energy circles. Maybe have some different perspectives about how that's changed over the ages. So with that, I give you Reece, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. Okay.
Perfect. I'll share my screen. All right, you can see it okay. Thanks for the introduction. It's really good to be back. I don't think I've been on campus for over a year, so it's been cool to see the new building. That's really exciting. Thanks for having me. Let's see if that will change slides. Okay. Oh, I could just do it. I just click. That's okay. So for today, as Darren mentioned, I'll share a little bit about me, but then kind of go into the federal program development, how programs come to be, if they're existing, how do they continue? Oh, thank you. And then sharing the life cycle of a funding opportunity, so how federal funds and support actually trickle down to projects or communities themselves. And then at the end, sharing more about my experience at the DOE and OSED, which is the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, with time for questions at the end. So I graduated here in 2022 with a degree I did energy science and technology and minor in energy policy. I also got a degree in German while I was here and was part of the Women in Energy Mentoring Network. I think that still exists, hopefully. Okay, cool. And then after I graduated, I spent a year abroad teaching English through the Fulbright program, but really missed being in the energy world. So I applied for something called the DOE Scholars Program. Just was supposed to be a summer internship, and they ended up hiring me on the spot. So that's kind of how I got started with a career in federal government, which wasn't necessarily my plan, but I'm really happy that it happened because I learned a bunch through it, and here to talk to you today about it. So specifically, I was under the Industrial Demonstrations Program. I'll talk more about what that actually means, kind of using that as a case study as we talk about federal program development. It's pretty important to know, I think, just because there's a lot of nuances. I don't think a lot of people realize the whole process. I didn't know coming into the role what it actually takes for a project or a community to see any kind of federal funding. And as you listen, I'm encouraging you to kind of pick out parts that maybe are of more interest to you, what you're interested in, or maybe where you could see yourself fitting in. There's a lot of opportunities for recent grads or students to get some federal experience, just add to your resume, or if you're thinking about a career. I'm happy to talk more about that at the end too, if there's time. So as I've been saying, I worked for almost 2 years in the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations. It was established under the Biden administration. As a disclaimer, it doesn't exist anymore. We can talk about that too. The OSED itself had 9 divisions. There was $27 billion of funding for this office, kind of distributed throughout the 9 divisions. I was part of the Industrial Demonstrations Program, so we focused on industrial decarbonization. And hydrogen hubs was probably the biggest one under advanced nuclear and carbon management. So this office all came together. We had a portfolio analysis team as well that kind of looked at the office holistically. There's also a community benefits team that's not listed here that specifically was dedicated to making sure that the communities, the local communities were, there was attention given to them and considerations as we're giving them this funding. So starting out with how federal programs develop, it all starts with the administration goals and priorities. So, you can answer questions like, why do the administration goals and priorities shape or how do they shape into actionable projects? What kind of solutions are they trying to come up with? And And then next is the budget and legislation. So questions like, how does legislation shape the budget, the federal budget, and how can the legislation and funding bring solutions to the administration priorities? We'll answer all of these questions as we go. Then you have the program itself. So these are the questions that we can answer are like, how are federal programs developed? How do offices and programs operate? What kind of guidelines do they operate under? And then after the program gets established or continues on, that's when the funding opportunities actually are established and developed or created. So how are they created? What even is a funding opportunity? And what is the process of creating one? And how does it reach the masses? Finally, we have the project review and execution. So that's when the money actually is, or support is actually being seen by the communities. And, we'll talk about how projects are reviewed, how are they selected, and how does the funding reach industries, communities, and projects. So that's kind of the general life cycle. Starting with the administration goals and priorities. So in the case for OSED, in January of 21, Biden was inaugurated and he had a lot of climate goals, such as reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 50% below 2005 levels by 2030, among other goals, and then reaching net zero by 2050. There was also a lot of Justice 40, if you've heard of that term before. Think of like the clean energy transition, the just transition, a lot of community benefits, priorities when it comes to the clean energy transition. And so we saw a lot of that in the legislation, which was kind of unprecedented. And you'll see how that kind of manifests as we go. So that was Biden's goal. That was his priority when it comes to that, again, among other things. And that led to the budget and the legislation for that administration or that fiscal year. So in the case for OSED, in December of 21, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law was passed. It was formerly called the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA. There's alphabet soup in federal government. You kind of get used to the acronyms, but if something isn't clear, let me know. This was passed to manage large-scale clean energy demonstration projects across multiple technology areas. And OSED was established to manage those projects. So it was actually written in legislation. I'll show you kind of the language in a second, specifically to create, these industrial decarbonization projects. Later, in August of 22, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of IRA. It was the largest U.S. climate bill ever. It was about $370 billion, all dedicated to clean energy, energy security, clean energy initiatives, things like that. So we got additional funding from IRA as well, which is how we came to be $27 billion program. Really quick, as we're talking about budget and legislation, I just wanted to highlight this resource. If you've ever heard of usaspending.gov, super easy to go down a rabbit hole on this website. It basically tracks the resources or the budget allocations, the spending of a current administration. You can track by state or by program, by different departments, things like that. This is just a screenshot of the website specifically for the Department of Energy that shows their $100 billion budget, which is only 0.9% of the fiscal year budget of 26, which I think is crazy. So if you have more questions after this, or you're just curious, I recommend or not taking a look at that, depending on how you're feeling. And yeah, it's very interesting. You can really see everything in real time. And this is kind of a lot of a slide, but I do think it's important to highlight the differences of funding. So there's not just one type of federal support that you can get. This is non-exhaustive, but these are kind of the main buckets. They're all governed by something called 2 CFR 200, again, another acronym, the Code of Federal Regulations. It's basically the Bible of how to spend line by line government money, what's allowed and what's not allowed. So starting out with grants, that's probably the most typical form of federal funding that you think about. It is usually for a research project or research and development, community programs, public health initiatives, things like that. You don't have to repay it once you get accepted for the award, you're given the funding, and good luck, have fun. On the other hand, there's cooperative agreements, which similar process, you're given this award. However, there's substantial federal involvement. So that's what I'm experienced with cooperative agreements, because the projects that we worked on were pretty complex, pretty high risk. Basically what that meant is the federal government and the private industry shared ownership of the project. So it meant a lot more reporting, a lot more oversight on the federal government side, which for me was really cool because I got kind of more hands in the bucket when it came to projects. So I got to see a lot more rather than just letting them go on their merry way. And you also got to work a lot more closely and collaboratively with the private industry. So you got to network a lot with that. But yeah, a lot more federal involvement with cooperative agreements. Contracts are not necessarily financial assistance because they're used to purchase specific goods or services for the government. So think IT support, software programs. There's a lot of defense contracts, even a lot of they're not necessarily employees for the government, but a lot of people work for companies that are then contracted by the federal government, so consultants. There's a lot of consulting when it comes to federal government. I think it's like 50% of the workforce or something like that are all contractors. Then we have loans. So the main part of loans is that they have to be repaid. So if you're on a student loan, similar concept. They're usually for large capital-intensive infrastructure projects. If it's too risky for private funding to just front all the money up front, they'll get the loan and then pay them back in the future. And then tax incentives and credits. So I remember when I was at Western, we talked about the production tax credit, investment tax credit, similar concepts. The difference, I think the main thing here is that it's not application-based. There's no competition. If you're eligible, you get the tax credit. So it really incentivizes in the space of clean energy adoption, because anybody could be eligible. If they're eligible, then they can get the funding. Any questions on that before I move on? Okay. Yes, that's your exit ticket. Highlighting more about OSED's background. So the goal was to accelerate clean energy technologies from lab to market and fill this critical innovation gap while mitigating risks. So because the federal government had so much involvement, we were able to mitigate the risk of private funding the whole entire project. And like I mentioned before, the bipartisan infrastructure law and IRA appropriated $27 billion to our programs. The main point of this slide is just as another disclaimer. There has been a big reorg of the Department of Energy, and as of November, all the offices are now different names. So OSED no longer exists. If you try to look it up to learn more about it, you won't come anywhere close to finding help. So the legislation, though, this kind of gives you more of an overview of the actual language that was used to establish a program like OSED. I won't get into the nitty-gritty details. The main thing I wanted to highlight was an example of how legislation has to be interpreted by the program. So the language in the bottom bullet, I guess I could use my thing so that people can see. So this bullet right here, the greatest good for the greatest number, that was in the legislation and nobody knew how to interpret it or what it meant because it's so broad. So that was kind of when the program had to come in, or OSED had to come in and figure out, like, what does that mean and how can we apply that to actually make a lasting impact when it comes to GHG emissions and impacting the communities involved. So we kind of came up with this idea that exactly what it sounds like. It sounds a little bit, we kind of made a big deal out of nothing because to me, it's pretty clear. But just making sure that the project, whatever it is impacting the community in a way that makes the most change, lasting change for the best, for the good. So that's an example of legislation. If you're more curious about that part, in the slide deck at the end, I have some additional slides that have more. Let's see here. Okay, so the budget legislation, that's all fine and dandy. It's written down. Now what? Now that's when the program gets established. So in this case, after bill was passed, OSED came to be, and we spent about 2 years planning, standing up the program, what that means, hiring people, having bylaws and different processes put in place. We got $21 billion from bill and then $5.8 billion from IRA. The IRA funding had a time horizon. We had to obligate it to a project by 2026, and it had to be spent by 2031. This was all just to kind of, because the climate goals were so aggressive, getting to net zero by 2050, this was kind of the push that the program needed to make sure that that was done in a timely manner. So thinking about building a federal program, it's really up to the program at this point. The administration and kind of the higher ups have less skin in the game, or not skin in the game, but less hands in the pot, I guess, because they have other things to deal with. So now it's up to the program. So if you think about it like a three-legged stool, this is kind of how a successful program is developed. So in our case, OSED is the seat, and the three stools are the executive goals or the administration priorities, like we talked about. Legislation guidelines, so what are the bounds in which we can work? What is the actual rules that we have to follow? How much money do we have? That kind of stuff. And another really important leg is the stakeholder engagement. So actually looking outside of the federal context and looking out to industry. What do they need? How do they interpret the legislation? How can we utilize this legislation to impact them in a way that makes sense? And then also, how do we reach the communities? What does the community need? And how can we kind of shape our program to make sure that all the voices are heard, or that, you know, it could have a lasting impact? So it's a very fragile stool, if you can guess. And if one leg breaks, then the person falls over. So I think it's a good analogy when you're thinking about kind of how a program comes to be. For OSED, we had over 400 engagements before the first funding opportunity even got published. We were targeting industry sectors and technologies with potential for high market adoption to maximize our impact. So we were talking to really large corporations, trying to see like, hey, if this funding came to be, what would you do with it? What are the things out there? Like, what are your ideas? We had a lot of in-person meetings and conferences, virtual presentations, just sharing what OSED was, sharing more about IRA and Bill, and then one-on-one meetings and relationship building with, you know, specific companies or just kind of like industrial leaders to figure out the best way to bring this funding to the front lines. A little bit more on stakeholder engagement. Really the goal outside of keeping the person on the stool is to raise awareness of the program first and foremost. Encourage strong applicants that meet OSED's goals, so making sure that, you know, the people that can actually make an impact are the ones that know that we exist, and maybe some that we didn't know about are also applying. And building relationships with collaborators who are willing to amplify program news to high impact, high interested stakeholders. So, you know, having some people do the work for us just through networking, and then plan for early community engagement, like I mentioned before, and making sure the needs of the local stakeholders can be met. Industrial demonstrations program, so the specific program I worked under, the timing of our division was actually very good because AMO, the Advanced Manufacturing Office, released an industrial decarbonization roadmap. If you're a nerd like me, it's kind of a dense roadmap kind of booklet, but it's pretty interesting. They convened with a bunch of industry subject matter experts just to kind of get the lay of the land for industry. Things like the food and beverage sector, steel, chemicals, all things like that, and assessed what was needed in order to reach net zero. And they published it in this huge book. So we utilized their research a lot when we thought about writing our FOA and creating our program, including evaluating workforce considerations. So they even reached out to local communities and like unions, for example. So that was kind of another example about how the federal government, we collaborate with a lot of different offices pretty frequently and kind of share the knowledge when we can. So that was really helpful for us. And so, okay, awesome. We have all of this information. Now what do we do with it? Now we create the funding opportunity, or the FOA. The first FOA was released in September of 22 within OSED. This was the hydrogen hubs. So they were the first ones to kind of get their funding opportunities out the door. IDP, or industrial demonstrations, we released ours in March of 23. So about a year plus to develop this whole FOA. And I'll explain why. You're like, oh, it's just writing down a document of things that are already written down. Why does that take so long? It's because in the government, everything is very structured and very hierarchical. So there's a lot of acronyms on this screen, but basically what the point is that, S3 is kind of the top dog, in this case, Chris Wright, of the DOE, OMB, or the White House. So the legal team, everybody has to have eyes on little tiny words and every section before it actually gets published. So that process takes a really long time. And it encompasses a lot. So a funding opportunity encompasses everything from the goals of the program. It outlines eligibility, so who can actually apply for this funding, and describes the process. So how much money can you get? What does the application process look like? What does the merit review process look like? It's super all-encompassing when it comes to this money so that everybody knows what's going on. And it takes a lot. So a lot of people see it. Business leaders collaborate on it. Engineers, compliance and regulation specialists, that's a big one. In our case, community benefits had a whole section dedicated just to kind of trying to solicit ideas for community benefits plans. National labs we work with a lot as well, not only on the FOA process, but in general. So I think that's a really cool opportunity for students as well. There's multiple iterations and modifications of this document. It really goes in loops, and it doesn't get published until that loop ends, which can take a long time. A little bit more about the timeline of a FOA. So the notice of intent, think about when we're doing the stakeholder engagement. The funding opportunity finally gets released. In the case for a large program like ours, we had concept papers, which is basically an abbreviated application that's about 2 pages rather than 100, just to gauge eligibility, compliance, making sure their idea actually makes sense, just to help kind of save industry time, but also save the federal side time. Because these applications can cost hundreds of thousands, about $100,000 to write. If we can save them money, it would save us time. Everybody wins. So that's kind of the goal of a concept paper review. That could take in our case, about 6 months. Then we release encourage or discourage letters. If they receive a discourage letter, they can't apply for the program. Encourage letter, they can, they don't have to. Then there's the application phase. It dwindles it down even more. The federal side reviews it, and then there's the selection of projects once they get announced. Then there's a negotiation period, and then that's when, after the negotiation period, that's when the project actually starts. So it's kind of a very long process that can be monotonous or frustrating, but it is kind of the way it all works to make sure taxpayer dollars are spent appropriately. In the case for the industrial demonstrations program, this is kind of an overview of our FOA. So on the left is our goals, basically increasing industry and manufacturing competitiveness within the US, so trying to keep things in the US, and our export competitiveness as well, while achieving these emission reductions in the non-power sector. So think about like steel, chemical, food and beverage, glass, large industries were kind of our target audience. I mentioned before we had some funding from Bill. We had $500 million from Bill. There was no funding horizon with this one, so we were able to take our time a little bit more with these projects. This was dedicated to new builds, and then we had $5.8 billion from IRA. Those were the ones that had to be spent by 2031. So we use these for like retrofits, overhauls, engineering studies, anything that fit within industrial decarbonization that could get done fairly quickly. Another thing to highlight is our funding was, like I mentioned, a cooperative agreement, which was 50-50 cost share. So whatever the federal government gave them in the award, they had to either beat or match, just to make sure that there's kind of shared ownership within the project. A little bit more about the funding opportunity. There's a lot of words here, but just to give you an idea of kind of a summary of a FOA. Some things to highlight, it says the industrial sectors that we worked on. Our priorities were the greenhouse gas emissions reduction potential, replicability, and timeliness. So we wanted these projects to be first of a kind, but replicable, so that there could be offtake and it can actually have impact in other industries or within other companies in the sector. Market viability through clean product demand, so can it actually make money? Does it make sense? And community benefits, like I've talked about a lot. We had a huge priority on making sure that the local community was considered as these projects were being stood up. So certain technologies that we saw were energy efficiency, so a lot of energy efficiency retrofits, electrification of different processes, which is pretty interesting for something like an industrial sector that's been running off of natural gas since the Industrial Revolution, low carbon fuels and low carbon feedstocks, carbon capture, which was interesting as well, and then an integrated approach, so a mix of all three, or something super new and innovative. I won't talk about that. Okay, so our funding opportunity is out in the world. Now what? Now we get to review projects and actually execute. So in October of 23, that's when the first 7 hydrogen hubs were actually selected. So about a year of application process and getting these selected, the merit review process. In March of 2024, IDP selected their 33 projects. And then they actually received funding later. So in IDP's case, in August of 24. So that kind of shows the negotiation period as well, taking anywhere from 3 months to a year. In our case, it was super fast, dare I say efficient. And actually some of the fastest in DOE history, not to brag, but all right, so I kind of talked about this a little bit with the applications and merit review. It really does depend on the budget size and the program itself. With the concept papers and the application stage, they're all submitted on an online portal. I have a link to the previous EERE office, so the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. Exchange is what the portal was called, so I linked it if you're curious about old FOAs that have probably died or stayed alive. This is kind of the general format of the merit review process once applications get submitted. Yeah, I'll start with this. So an application gets submitted. There's a merit review process that's external to federal government's experts. So we bring in subject matter experts from all over the industry, whether it's business experts, technology experts, finance experts, all sorts of things, and they take a look at this review or this application and give it scores. They give it strengths and weaknesses, that provide comments, and the federal government is not involved to reduce bias. We call these independent reviewers. There is a federal review panel that convenes after the independent reviewers. They kind of get together, take all of the scores and the weaknesses into account and convene, kind of rank them and decide who should get an interview. So once the applicant gets interviewed, everybody reconvenes, the federal panel reconvenes and decides. They come up with a ranked list with program policy factors or PPFs. So things like, you know, this is a great project and it happens to be in a location where there's a ton of, you know, where the chemical industry is really big and it can make a lot more impact because there's a lot of smog or whatever from other industries. So they just kind of look at it, yeah, outside of just the application itself and apply it to a broader landscape. And then the selection official is that one that actually gets to select the project. So taking in the merit reviewers, the federal panel, everything into account, the selection official is the one that actually gets to sign and press the green button on which applications actually get to move on within the budget constraints. They do this so that one person gets signing authority. Like I mentioned before, the federal government's very hierarchical, so there's always one person that gives the okay. And also to reduce liability on like a lot of people, there is one person, which I guess is helpful. So they selected the projects. Administration gets briefed. There's a ton that happens in like 3 weeks before the applicants actually get notified. Here's a larger breakdown. It's basically the same thing that I just said in with more pictures. After the selection official approves selects the projects, one thing I did want to highlight here is the legal reviews and the checks and balances and the iterations. And you have to brief the White House. So I remember making briefing decks or slide decks that, you know, Chris Wright, well, at that point it wasn't Chris Wright, but the top of DOE would see, or the White House would see. So that was pretty cool. It was pretty rewarding to be able to make a slide deck about all of these really cool projects that senior leadership or some pretty important people get to see. Also just seeing the projects in general for all the applications was really, really awesome. Seeing some of the ideas that industry had was really cool, whether they got selected or not. I still got exposed to a lot of really cool things. And that was all thanks, well, not just because it was a cooperative agreement, but largely because of that. You just get a little bit more immersed, I guess, in the project itself and have a little bit more ownership. So that was a really cool experience, was seeing all of the applications and just seeing, like who applied, because they're, people that you see every day, especially if it's a big industry. I can do this. I won't talk about this too much, but we had metrics that we used to evaluate all of the projects. So in our case, it's pretty general. So I think this applies to a lot of projects, with the exception of maybe the community benefits plan. On the right side, when we look at the different criterion, so technical merit and innovation and impact, so that's where our technology experts would evaluate those aspects of the application. Financial and market viability, so does this business actually make money? Could they sustain themselves? Can they manage money appropriately and responsibly? Work plan, and also the management team and project partners. So do they have people that are willing to accept this product? Can their team execute things like that? And then the community benefits plan. So how much are they considering their community within this project? So these are all things that we considered as we're doing the merit review. Again, OSED was a little bit different for a lot of different reasons, but the general template kind of remains the same. Talking about community benefits. So here's an example of a program policy factor, or the geographical consideration when we're talking about environmental justice. So this graph shows the facilities that are emitting more than 25,000 metric tons of CO2e annually. So as you can see, for example, like the chemicals sector, a lot of it is in the southeast, or food and beverage is also very concentrated in one area, iron and steel. So we think about this when we think about which applications or which projects are getting selected, because that's impacting the greatest good, or having the greatest good to the greatest number of people. So, if we have a chemical project that's kind of in the middle of nowhere and nobody ever sees it, or it doesn't actually emit that much, or things like that, it's not going to impact as much. So as high quality as a project might be, it might not make the most sense in terms of receiving federal funding. So I'm just sharing that as kind of an example of the considerations that need to take place in this merit review, especially when it comes to environmental justice. Like I mentioned, once we get a selected group of projects or project, there's a negotiation period. This basically just solidifies the scope, schedule, budget in a formal contract. A lot could have changed in the time when when they submitted their application even. So getting all of the updated processes, how far along in the project are they if they continued work? It's where they really get to know the compliance requirements, what do they have to report, how often do they have to report. This involves a lot of internal and external meetings, a lot of back and forth to gather all the documentation and get all your ducks in a row, that kind of thing. So that can take another 4 months, well, it could be up to a year. But again, we did it pretty quick in like 3 months, I think. Or actually, our quickest one was in like 7 days. So pretty unheard of. But yeah, so that's a whole other process that has to take place before they actually receive funding. And again, it's all just to make sure that the taxpayer dollars are stewarded properly and appropriately, and making sure everything is documented. So once the negotiations are final, then that award is actually announced publicly, then the funding is obligated, and the project work can actually begin. So this is why when everyone talks about like the red tape and why things take so long, this is probably why, or this is what they're in reference to, because it takes so long for the project to actually see any funding, which can really make or break a project if it takes too long. It was the case for a lot of our projects. When they realized how long this whole process would take, they just backed out. And then once the project does receive funding, especially in the case for a cooperative agreement, when there is a lot of reporting involved, the work does not stop there. So your role kind of changes from a reviewer to making sure the progress reports get submitted on time, financial reporting, everything like that. They're they're being compliant with the contract and the Code of Federal Regulations, and then monitoring the performance, making sure that they're still alive. And then once all the work ends, there's something called closeout, which is basically just making sure all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed. Things that have to take place. So if the government paid for a piece of equipment, for example, like what happens now if the project's over? Who gets the equipment? If they sell it, who gets that money? That's usually determined in the negotiation process, but making sure that the reports are submitted and making sure that actually gets carried out as part of the closeout process, for example. Same with IP or the data management. And then a lot of these records have to be retained for, depending on the project, a specific period, anywhere from 3 to 7 years. So making sure those get stored in a proper way as well. So that's kind of the whole thing when it comes to federal funding and how projects get to see or how projects actually get funded. Switching to what it's actually like working, or in my experience, working for the DOE and OSED specifically. I mentioned a little bit, it was super cool to see the projects and see the applications, work with the industry. It was really rewarding also just being a civil servant, despite the challenges of the end. Just being a steward of taxpayer dollars, it's kind of like, it's a pretty cool position to be in if you think about it that way. And especially for a first job right out of college, to just serve in that role, I think was really rewarding, especially in the clean energy space, which is what I'm passionate about. I worked remotely, but I got to travel to DC quite a bit. I think it was probably once a month for like 6 months because I chose to. That was kind of what I wanted to do. So I went to DC quite a bit. There was a cohort of folks that lived in DC and worked in the headquarters every day. I had the option to do that. So if you're interested in DC, that's definitely an option, especially now. And then we also got to travel quite a bit to Baltimore, Pittsburgh, and Denver we had different offsite meetings, negotiation meetings. I unfortunately never got to go on a site visit, but that was in the cards. So traveling all over the US to visit these projects and be boots on the ground is also a potential. And then, like I mentioned, a lot of coworkers actually lived in DC and worked from there. It was a really great way to get exposed to not only federal programs and how kind of the behind the scenes of federal government, but also private industry. I networked a ton with all of my projects that I worked on and still talk to a lot of them after the fact, and collaborating with teams of various domains. So not only externally with all of the subject matter experts in the industries, but also internally. There's all these different branches. There's engineers, there's the national labs, there's community benefit specialists, there's NEPA specialists, there's all sorts of different people that I came in contact with every single day and got to learn a lot from them. So that exposure, I think, was pretty valuable, and you can't really get that in any other area other than working in a federal government space. You can call it trauma bonding or whatever you want, but I did develop lifelong friendships, and like I mentioned, building a really strong network. It's cool to be in a space, especially when it's something like clean energy. Everybody had the same mission, everybody had the same goal, and the way that our office worked together was really cool to experience a team like that. Especially because we had to work on such short timelines. I think we all worked really long days sometimes, because we wanted to, because we were motivated to, because we knew that what we were doing was really important. So that was really cool to experience as well. And then working for the federal government, I'm sure you've heard the benefits are really great. I had really awesome healthcare and also just career growth opportunities. It's really cool. You can kind of go between different departments. There's lots of different programs to stay within to get exposure to different offices, but also professional development, just like leadership, if that's interesting to you, or all these different like Excel courses. Like there's a bunch of different things that are offered to you, and just because you're a federal employee. On the other hand, there is a lot of federal red tape and bureaucracy that I kind of alluded to it before, can stunt a lot of progress. It can be a little bit defeating or frustrating, especially if a project that you think is really cool backs out because it was taking too long or it didn't get approved. And a lot of the federal regulations are a little bit dated. so that they can kind of conflict with some of the legislation and nobody knows what's right and what's wrong. And I was employed during an administration change, which is always a challenge. This one obviously had some unprecedented challenges and unpredictable cuts. But, you know, working in the federal government, that's something that you have to handle every 4 years, which can also kind of be a negative, not kind of, it was a negative. But if you are interested at all in working for the federal government, or even just getting some experience, whether it's through an internship or a fellowship, here's some great ideas. They're linked too. So the DOE Scholars Program, that's what I applied for originally. It was kind of a summer internship. A lot of these you go in person to DC, and basically like an office will see your application and offer, you know, an internship for, I think it was 8 weeks. You get a stipend too, and to help you kind of live in DC and pay for a little bit of your way. Pathways program and the student experience program. These also include kind of internships, volunteering, or mentorships to get you more hands-on experience with the federal government. Fellowships are also, you know, they can be a little bit longer term. ORISE, I think, is, I don't know if it's publicized here, but it's pretty well known. It's the Oak Ridge Institute for Science and Education. So they have a bunch of things, not only with the federal government, but also national labs. And some really cool research projects. So it's a little bit more STEM focused if you're interested in that, and kind of have, if you go on their website, it has more listed kind of already pre-planned things that you could be working on. So you can find one that interests you. The AAAS is the advancement or American advancement of, oh yeah, that's what you did, right? Okay. American Association for the Advancement of Science. I guess Darren can tell you a lot more about that, but that is a great pipeline for a federal career as well. I knew a few AAS fellows that were with OSED and then they ended up just staying after their fellowship. I mentioned before contracting. So if you don't want to work for the federal government, but you want to be involved in that kind of world, working for a company that then is a consultant for the federal government is another option. You don't get like the same benefits, obviously, but you get whatever that company offers. So also a good option for a lot of people. Same with national labs too. That's an option. Usually they're considered kind of a contractor. And then job boards. So I listed a few. usajobs.gov is probably the main one where it's all of the opportunities that you can think of. And then Zintellect. So those are the two main job boards, but also just networking. If you know some, or me, like if you're interested and have questions, let me know. I'm on LinkedIn. And yeah, just kind of knowing your network, and usually they have a good spot or a good kind of intel on what's around and what's offered. Okay, cool. Are there any questions that I can answer?
And Reece, if I can ask you to repeat any questions that come here so that folks online can hear them.
Sure.
Who's ready to sign up for a federal government job in the Department of Energy? There's one.
Nice.
Some tentative hands. All right, I have some questions, and I'll take the first one.
Sure.
Probably don't have to repeat my questions. I have a big mouth.
Okay.
Teacher voice. A couple of, so you mentioned at one point that some of these applicants might spend $100,000 to prepare an application.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say a little bit more, just for those of us who aren't used to thinking in that many zeros, how that can happen, how that's possible, what that looks like in the space that you were working in DOE?
That's a good question. It's funny you say it. So the question was, if you didn't hear online, why does it cost $100,000 to make an application? I also was not used to many zeros. I wasn't used to a B next to things for a long time, even an M, let alone a B. So it was a lot of money that I would see on my computer, like in my room. Like it was really weird, but really weird. But yeah, it was so real. And so I think first of all, especially in like large industries like a steel company, they operate on an order of magnitude probably higher than many of us are used to, just in general. But an application itself can cost so much because a lot of people hire outside consultants to draft these applications for them unless they have specifically like a federal regulation or federal relations person. But it takes a lot. They need a lot of different documentation for an application. So not only just like what their project is or a project summary, they need financial documentation, making sure that their finances are in check. They need really in detail or really in-depth technical analysis of what their project is. So a lot of times it's an engineering study or a feed study or something like that, which costs money to compile and compute. What else? Community benefits plans. Those were just 10 pages of all sorts of different ways that they're going to impact the community. So not only do they need to actually have these papers in hand, but they need to have some form of proof that it exists. So that whole process takes a lot of planning, a lot of documentation, and a lot of brain power and mental power and elbow grease to put together. I think I'm probably forgetting some big operations documents. Who is their CEO and who's going to be managing this project? Are they capable? Are they going to go bankrupt in a few years? Are they going to be, good stewards of the taxpayer dollar? Do they have any past debt or have they come in contact with some law before? It just it's a lot. I think our applications averaged, we had a cap, but I think they were probably like 100 pages of just like really detailed small print. So yeah, that takes a lot, and people charge a lot of money per hour to write stuff down.
Is it, I would imagine this is a big factor, but I've never participated. Just like the government has to really prove that they're being fair to all applicants and whatnot. I would imagine that gets pretty time consuming in the whole process. Like you have to be very transparent and just to avoid lawsuits of like, hey, I didn't get treated fairly, I want my chance at the funding.
Oh yeah.
Is that
a
significant factor?
Yeah, and that can take a lot of time too. The question was, making sure that everybody is treated fairly, and if projects kind of dispute that. I mentioned earlier the Code of Federal Regulations. It's like the Bible of federal or financial assistance. That is referenced a lot. So we have a legal team specifically for this kind of stuff that makes sure that, line by line, all of the money is allocable. What was it? Allocable, reasonable, necessary, and there's another A. But anyways, there's like it's a whole book. It's thousands of pages of what actually we're allowed to spend money on, and making sure that all gets documented to cover, make sure that everything is good. If we were to get audited, but also if a project were to come to us and say, hey, we got this fund, or we didn't get this funded, but this project did, because we're very much in the public eye. So we have not only a legal team, but also public relations team and media teams and things like that to make sure that everything looks good. Obviously, things get overlooked. So that's when things get delayed or we have to go back and, make amends. Yeah.
So with those applications, is it private companies that do that, or is it primarily consultants like yourself that have been within the choosing those applications, that those companies that are looking for the grants, who do they go to? Do they go to companies? Do they go to seek out consultants?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question was, who do the companies go to help write the application, right? So yeah. It's up to them. They'll apply, even if it was a consultant, they would apply under that company's name as the primary recipient. They might be listed as like a partner, but for the most part, they write the proposal or they compile the proposal under that specific company. But they can seek out a consultant. There's kind of recurring names of the companies or the consultants that are experts in that field. Like they know exactly how to read a FOA and they know exactly what is needed to make a successful application. Some companies are stronger. Some people can do that internally if they do this all the time. There's some companies that just kind of recycle their grants or their funding opportunities over and over. So it's kind of copy paste. They already have what they need. They know what they're going to be asked for, and they have everything ready to go. Other companies, if they're new to financial assistance or getting federal government, they'll probably hire some kind of outside support that specializes in financial assistance. So I had a friend who actually worked in the DOE. Actually, I met her through an exchange program. But she worked for a consultant that specialized just in writing grants for companies, specifically in, I think it was marine and energy efficiency or something like that. But that was their job, and that's what they got paid for, because it is such a lucrative market if you think about it, which is interesting. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. That's a good question. So the question was, what's the learning curve like? I think having the background that the energy science or the energy department gave me was very helpful. I think I came in kind of a step higher than a lot of others, just because you get policy, you get economics, but you also get fundamental science and also technology when it comes to renewables or energy efficiency and things like that. So I think I had a very solid base knowledge. With that being said, OSED was kind of its own beast. So I was learning every day on the job. And I think that's the case with a lot of jobs, especially in early career, just figuring out how things worked. And also just, having your first job, you're like having to fill out different paperwork that you've never had to fill out before. I'm like, Mom, what does that mean? So that was a curve there. But yeah, I think there is a little bit of a learning curve and just getting used to, like I said, like the working in B's and not zeros or tens, it's more just like getting used to it, I think. And the DOE does have a lot of resources. So for example, my boss came to me one day and was like, we need someone in Power BI. We need a Power BI expert, which is kind of like, it's like, if you've heard of Tableau, it's very similar. It's a way to visualize data. It's like a software. It's graphics and data visualization program, basically. BI stands for business intelligence or something like that. So he was like, we need someone that's good at this. So my job was just to become an expert in that. And it was very self-directed. But DOE has a bunch of resources. They have like modules and courses and all these things. And he's like, here you go. Have fun. Tell me when you're done, basically. So obviously I had people that I could ask questions for and stuff like that, but I actually really liked it. I just kind of chugged away and made some cool stuff. And then I became the expert. And so then I led a team of people that we use Power BI for the merit review process, for example, and that's kind of what helped make it so efficient. So if there is a learning curve, they were really good about providing resources to help you with that. Our team was also very tight-knit. So I came in, I should have mentioned, my title was a project monitor or a physical scientist. They kind of went back and forth. And I worked under a lot of project managers. So I was really connected with project managers that were able to kind of share their expertise with me on project management, but also working in the federal government because I was new to that too. And we communicated very frequently, so that helped a lot. There was something else I was going to say and I lost my train of thought. Anyways, I think there was a learning curve, but for the most part, so the best part about being one of the first hires in industrial demonstrations program, every day was different. So every day, everybody was learning anyways. Every day we did something different. So it was, like I mentioned before, that whole timeline, I did that all in 2 years, which sounds like a long time, but a lot has to happen every day. So I was learning how to review an application as I did it, or, check for compliance or figure out how to read the Code of Federal Regulations as I did it. Holding meetings with like CFOs about equipment liens. I didn't even know what liens was when I was in the meeting, and I was supposed to lead it. So figuring that out on the job, like it's just kind of, every day was different, which is something that I really, really liked. That's not always the case with federal careers, but in an office like OSED, or when it's something as kind of quickly moving like clean energy, that's probably the case. Yeah.
I'll just address the elephant in the room. You don't have to answer if you don't want to, but I think we all saw the news things about Doge and administration change and coming out for clean energy. And I don't think a lot of us have a lot of context for what it felt like to be a federal worker working in that space at that time, especially working for an office that is ultimately closed.
Mhm.
So I was wondering kind of if you could provide some perspectives for civilians of what it was like also to work in an office that was something tech and Doge, and you don't have to go into details if you don't want to, but I think it's a question that maybe civilians might get to really see, like we read about Doge and these things, but
Yeah.
I felt like
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up. So the question was about experiencing Doge and especially with an office that got cut, what that was like. I alluded to it, a little bit of trauma bonding happened. It was really interesting because we would be getting, I don't know if you guys heard about the fork in the road email, like I was a recipient of it, you know, and that was really weird because then there would be a news article about all these people are getting the fork in the road emails, and you know, just reading the news side of it and being the actual person that got it in hand was kind of a weird experience because honestly, a lot of it kind of sucked because OSED specifically, among a lot of other offices, because it was established under the Biden administration, was super targeted. We had our own Doge representative for our office, just looking at everything. So we were getting heavily audited in a time where we were supposed to be moving at the speed of light, but we had to, you know, also deal with this audit and being called waste when we're, you know, doing something that we're all really passionate about and things like that. So it was really hard. And again, like the news, we all just couldn't look at the news because you would read things and you're like, that's not, like, I got the email. That's not what that said. Or like, what's going on here? And it didn't really matter what political party was involved. It was like you were the subject of like a really big deal, which was really weird because it was like your day to day and you were living it. And yeah, so it was really, that's kind of where it got defeating, was when a lot of the projects that we were working on, they all meant, even the projects themselves, like having to tell these companies that were really excited about their project, we have to put a halt on everything. And having to have those conversations was really difficult. So even like, yeah, for me, it was hard because you know, your career is kind of challenged and it's like, do I have to move to DC to keep my job, or am I going to keep my job, or what's happening? But also like, is this really awesome project that's going to do a lot of really good stuff and they're really excited about it? Is that going to keep going even if I'm not here? So it was challenging. But I think the aftermath of it all, what I have learned is that if the industry wants it to happen, they're still making it happen. So like I said, I'm still in contact with a lot of projects. Sure, the federal funding isn't there, but if it's important to them and they see the merit in it, they're still making it happen, which I think is really cool. And it has made a lot of people, I guess, realize what can be done differently, I think, in the future. So if anything, I think a lot of people that, like a lot of my old coworkers, we kind of got a fire lit under us to keep going, and whatever that means. And apply their experience in other ways. So it was really hard, especially with all the news going on and talking about it, or even like in your family, if they read the news and they're like, oh my gosh, you know, cool, no more waste. And you're like, oof, that was me. That I was the waste that they got rid of. Like, that's crazy. So yeah, but I think, like I said, we're keeping on as best we can. Yeah.
Did the project, the companies that were doing the projects, did they get to keep all of the their intellectual property and all of the anything else that came from it? I mean, were they given grants, or did the federal government get some part of their project?
Yeah, so some of the projects, if they were given money, so we were giving funding out kind of as in a gated process. So if the project won $75 million, maybe their first chunk would be, the early stages was less because it was just like feasibility studies and something that wasn't as expensive. But their first chunk would be like, you know, $100,000 at a time, which again sounds like a lot, but it wasn't for these companies. So if we had given them money before the project ended, they kept it and they kept working with it. But a lot of projects were cut or stopped wherever they were at. So yeah, it was kind of funny during, I shouldn't laugh, but during that whole process, we were like, get all this funding approved as fast as you can. Like, get it out of the door. Like, make sure it's good, make sure it's allowed, make sure sorry if you're on the mic and that's really loud, but make sure that like everything checks out, everything's documented, it's all legal, but get it out the door as fast as we can. Because we had the money in our bank account, it just had to get stewarded correctly. And making sure they were ready for the funding. So we did it as fast as we could. We did as much as we could. And the private industry and us, we were all kind of on the same team to make sure that happened. But yeah, a lot of the projects got canceled. Some of them got reabsorbed into other areas of the DOE, so they're not actually all dead. Like we had some cement projects that kind of aligned with some of Trump's administration goals, so I think they got reabsorbed elsewhere, and some other projects. So they weren't all a lost cause, which is exciting. Yeah.
Process of reviewing all the applications, did you ever notice any common characteristics of the applications that actually ended up getting accepted and passed that the ones who ended up getting rejected did not share?
That's a good question. I think so the question was if there are any common characteristics between the applications that got selected versus that didn't. I think going back to kind of the matrix that we used, or the metrics that we used to evaluate the projects, I think a strong community benefits plan helped a lot. So they were all weighted, all the criteria was weighted differently. But if we saw that the project had a really strong community benefits, kind of they were thinking about it holistically, and it wasn't just like, we're going to provide jobs. And it was more like, a lot of our employees, or there's like a pipeline from the university nearby to get them in through an internship or things like that. So they like really creative ideas, I think bode pretty well for applicants. A lot of, if they could prove that their technology was first of a kind, first and foremost, so like if it was maybe a pilot scale, they just needed a little push to become a demonstration scale, so like something that we could market, and then be replicable on top of that so that other companies can replicate it or take on after IP obviously like checks out. But that was a huge thing too, because we did want to have a lasting impact. And I think those are the main two that, and a huge one too was making sure that the company was just sound, like made sense financially. Some of the projects or applications, they did not have a really strong operational structure. Like we didn't believe, or the reviewers, I didn't actually have any say, but the reviewers didn't believe that they could really either fund it or manage it in an appropriate way to actually make it successful. So the management team, I think, was important as well.
Time maybe for one more question.
Yeah.
Big motivation between the 50/50 cost share thing? Is it just to get bigger companies involved?
Yeah, so the question was about the 50/50 cost share and why we did that. That was, it was to increase, so for projects that are really complex, or in this case, first of a kind, there's a lot of risk involved for a company to just make something a pilot scale and just produce it on their own. So the solution to that is to have 50% or less funded by the federal government and 50% or more funded by the private industry. So for the federal side, that means that we can have all these checks and balances with frequent reporting and collaboration to make sure that it's still going on par with, the technology is still working and it still makes sense to have this project and it's not crumbling and it's not taking too long and things like that. So the increased reporting in an ideal world improves kind of the success rate of the project, but then also on the federal or the private side, they don't have to fund it all on their own, so it can take away some of the stress of like private funding and figuring out how to come up with the money, especially if something like a very new technology, it might not actually make a lot of business sense. If it's a new technology, they don't know who's going to buy it, the product. It could be super expensive and might not actually pencil because it's the first time anybody's ever done it. This is a way to reduce that risk for having some federal funding involved. That makes sense. That answer your question?
Okay, another round of applause for me. Thank you all in here for the good questions and the careful attention. Thanks to you online for sticking with us. Thanks to my colleagues at the foundation for making the technological magic happen. And thanks to Reece for making the trip and telling an interesting story about an interesting time in the federal government. Those of you in the class, you'd hang around for a couple minutes. Those of you online, I guess you can go now. That's it. We'll see you next week. Oh, wait, so one more thing. Next week's talk will be Scott Herman, who's in the audience right now, talking about geothermal energy. And then 2 weeks from today, we'll have another alumnus talking about something that Reece mentioned several times, and that's community benefits agreements. So that graduate is working in Kentucky right now, negotiating community benefits agreements for a large-scale solar project on an abandoned coal mine site. Pretty cool, eh? It's what we do here. All right, signing off now.